Yeah, it's strange to be up here again, but actually, I was surprised when you used my real name, Eyob, which is still a shock to me because I'm still getting adjusted to my true identity. And I think what I want to share with you guys today is a journey of trauma. I think every one of us here has a story to tell. And I'm sure right now you either are in a trauma that you're unaware of, that you're reacting to, and maybe you're dealing with a host of issues. It could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be people, it could be many things. The beauty of life is that every one of us deals with issues. And that's why we need tissues. I feel like I'm rhyming right now. But those issues tend to, I know for me, distract us from the core issues. I'm not meaning to do any of this stuff, by the way. It's just, I'm not rhyming on purpose. What I mean by that is if you look at the surface level of your life, and the surface level of my life was I had a host of things I was dealing with. And I spent many years trying to find a remedy, a solution for it. And for a long time, it was sports. Sports was a remedy. I found my identity in sports. I was a very good athlete. I played soccer at a very high level. And as long as I was a good athlete, then I got all the validation I could ever need. And high school, therefore, for me, was actually a joy because I had created this personality or this person called Joe who allowed me to manage a lot of my underlying issues. And Joe was lovable, likable, outgoing, confident, smart, and also white. I was doing that for Norm. Norm's like, what? Who's this guy? Let me unpack that for you. When we first came so I was born in this tiny little place in Africa called Eritrea. Put your hand up if you know where that is. We're getting famous. This is so good because if I said this 10, 15 years ago, people were like, what, Eritrea? What is this? But it's this tiny little place in the Horn of Africa. It's located actually by the Red Sea. It's got an incredible history and heritage. And I was born in this tiny little place. When I was born, which was 1973, at the time, I was born into what's called, at the time anyways, there was a revolution. And my grandfather was a mayor of the city. So he was a respected man of God. And our family had a status in the community, in the country. But because of the revolution, the Ethiopians essentially were looking to take Eritrea. The Eritreans were trying to secede, leave, because we were fighting for the independence. But at that point, war started, and my grandfather was murdered. He was one of, the casualties of war. And I was born in, basically, I was born into a loss because we went from a family that had everything to suddenly loss after loss. There was, my uncle was wounded. Everybody fled from that situation. So my mother was carrying me at that time. And what happens in Africa and in a lot of third world countries when there's a death, and we see this actually in the biblical narrative, is that you wear black to show that you're mourning the loss. So my grandmother was wearing black and the whole time. But on the day of my birth, she made the decision that she would take the black and put on the white clothes. And when she told my mom, she said, God has blessed us. So then she came up. I had my actual name that I was going to be given was going to be Aaron. But my grandmother decided that she wanted to name me Eyob, which means Job. And the reason why she named me Job, obviously, if we know the story arc of Job, is that Job loses everything. And in the end, he gets it all back, actually tenfold. I didn't know that story. I was a baby. No one told me this, unfortunately, because I would have really, truly adopted that name. But for me, what happened is that I'm born into this mess, really. Not because I chose to, just life. And every one of us here, some of us are born into these incredible families, and some of us are born into dysfunctional families. Some people think it's luck. I really believe it's God's. He predestines us. He has a purpose for our lives. And so the place that we were born, the name that we were given, they're all really important. But a lot of times we don't really understand what the meaning of that is. And so often what we do is we try to live a life that is completely in contradiction of that because we don't have understanding. And so for me, what happened was, because when you have, you're raised in war and there's so much trauma. My mother has to flee with my little brother Israel. I never met my dad because of the war. He actually fled before I was born. And so I find myself being raised by my grandmother with my two sisters. And we're in a war-torn country. So it's full-on war, and everybody that is in that country at that point either is part of the quote-unquote rebel group who are fighting for independence, or were for the federal government, which was Ethiopia at the time. And so you had neighbors fighting neighbors. There was complete utter mistrust. And so much of probably the people in Ukraine right now, or in the Gaza, or wherever you might be, there's supposedly about 600 skirmishes around the world right now as we speak. Like, there's wars. There's always wars going on. And most of those wars are tribal, meaning they're friends against friends, family against friends, fighting over land most of the time. But the problem is that there's these casualties of war. And these are young little people, children, who just are there and trying to make sense of it. And so for me, I wish I could say my childhood was traumatic. Wasn't at all. There was tanks, there were soldiers, there's all kinds, but it's amazing what the brain can do. Someone said that recently. He said, "Do you know what's amazing about the brain?" I'm like, "No, tell me, please." He goes, "It adapts." We can adapt to any situation. We can adapt to addiction. We can adapt to success. We can adapt to misery. It's incredible what the brain does. It can survive. And so I learned to survive early on because that's what everybody was doing. There was nothing special about me. It was just a situation. And so I was loved. I was cared for. Yes, the circumstances surrounded me were not fun. It was in Canada, definitely. People are people are disappearing, and you don't know what's going on. People are fleeing. It's a desperate place. There's issues with hunger because of the wars. So much misery. But I had one of the most incredible grandmothers. She was a woman of God. She would take me to church in the mornings and pray. So I learned to pray early on. I learned to reverence God early on. I lived in a culture that revered God. God was central to every activity. Church wasn't something that you did on Sunday. Church was something that happened every day because the community actually congregated around church. When the priest would come, if they knocked on your door, you fed them. They were the most respected people in the community. You would house them. They would sleep over, and they literally, like the Levites in the scriptures, they actually lived off the blessings of the people, which is really fascinating. So I was raised in an incredible environment in sense of love. But something was broken in me that I did not know. And so at age 8, finally, my grandmother had died suddenly, and and you got to remember again, I'm in Africa, so they don't know how to communicate some of this stuff, especially, you're being raised in a time of war. And all I know is my grandmother was the most important human being in my life. And then suddenly she was taken and I didn't know. So the story, and this is all, like, every one of you here, I know we've all experienced events in our lives. It's not the event, because two people can experience the same event. My sisters were there too. They were experiencing the same event. But it's the interpretation of the event. It's the wound. Sometimes it's how we see the event. And for me, early on, the narrative was that I am not worthy enough, that the people that love me the most will abandon me. Is that a story that I knew? No, this is now hindsight. It's 2020. As I've done so much work, I'm able to look back and go, oh my gosh, that was the story. That's the narrative. And so if you have a story that says, I'm not worthy, that I'm going to be abandoned, what do you think you're going to do most of your life? You're going to make sure that nobody ever abandons you. And so how do you do that? Well, you hide. You create this nice, beautiful looking coffin, and then you put these, beautiful little things on the outside, so everybody looks at it and goes, wow, this is one beautiful coffin. But really, I'm in prison. And so for most of my life, I did not know how to actually be myself. What I was really good was I was very good at fitting in. I could adapt to any situation, any event, any moment. And so I become likable because I can fit in any circumstance. I'm moldable. It's like, ooh, and it became almost like a character trait that I carried. I'm like, I'm adaptable. Any situation, any condition, I'm good. What I didn't know is, I should have changed the language. The language is that I was really good at surviving, because somehow there's a book on trauma that says the body remembers. The trauma was somehow lodged in my body, and all I was doing was reacting to that trauma. So all my activities were in reaction to this trauma. It's unseen. And so at age 8, I'm suddenly taken to the capital city of Ethiopia, which is Addis Ababa. We stayed there for 3 months, don't know what's going on. And then 3 months later, this van comes, picks us up. I'm at the airport. And next thing you know, we're dropped off in Rome, Italy. And I meet my father for the first time in my life. Staggering, eh? So cool. And there's a whole storyline about my mom and my dad and what they did in order to get us to Italy, the sacrifices that they made, the reason why my dad fled, his commitment. I mean, the man's commitment to his family, it's unwavering. He did everything he could to make sure that we as a family would be united. And so here we are, we're being united, and I meet my dad for the first time, and I don't know how to address my dad because I've never met the man. He's a stranger to me. And so now I have to readjust to a new culture, a new family, a new way of living. And then I have a brother to compete with, which was not fun. He was cute, really cute, and could talk. I was very shy. And so this is the family dynamic that we're raised in. And my family, they do the best that they can to make sure that we're receiving all the emotional needs that we have, but there is something in me that is unsatisfied. And the way I dealt with it when I was little was I just wouldn't talk to no one. So I didn't talk for most of my, from up until I was grade 9, I literally didn't talk to no one. I would just keep everything inside, internalized, because I just didn't know how to communicate what I was feeling. And so we're in Italy, and then from Italy, 2 years later, I've just learned Italian. I'm walking around going, buongiorno, come sta? Pizza. That's all I know now, sadly enough. We're taken to Brockville, Ontario. Imagine, okay, so we're Rome, Italy. Then we lived in Milano, which is what? Milano, anybody know Milano? The fashion capital of the world. And then, like, and then I'm in Brockville, Ontario. And I have this little joke I always tell. It's like the population was 25,000 people, and they were all old. It wasn't true, but that was sort of the feeling I had. And so we're in this tiny little environment. And now what I don't know is that we were actually sponsored by this amazing church community. My uncle had met these missionaries in Egypt. When he fled and he was shot, he actually becomes a doctor. Incredible story. And he meets these missionaries who end up, loving on him and befriending him. And he knew Christ at the time. And he told our story to them, and they were so moved that they wrote a letter to their home church and said, hey, we need to bring this family. And so we were sponsored. So just look at the ark here, the hand of God over our. My mom always reminds me, she says, you are blessed because you could have gone to war and died. There's so many things that could have happened. So that's the story arc of God's blessing, but there's this other story, this other narrative, which is God doesn't love me. And this is what I'm dealing with. This is the truth, but this is the emotion. This is the trauma. This is the experience. And so we go from Brockville and have these really challenging experiences, especially we were the only black family in that community at the time. We actually made the front page. But the shocking part of the story, this is the funny part of the story, is I got to bring the picture for you guys. Maybe we can have a show and tell kind of day where I'll bring the family album. And in the album, okay, here's this family. And the story is like, we've come from this like desperate place. And at the time, Ethiopia there's pictures that you see as starving families and all this stuff. So this is I'm sure this is the story they told the government of Canada to make sure that we were sponsored. But the picture is the irony of it all, it's so hilarious. So there's this picture of our family, and we are dressed to the nines. My mother is wearing a fur coat. I mean, we look good. And then we just came from Italy. This is how everybody dresses. Doesn't matter how. So I always laugh at that in the sense of, but this is how God sees us. It's a picture of God in the sense that, humanity sees the desperation that we're in. It sees the scars in our lives, but God sees us as the apple of his eyes. And we're such loved family. And so the story is that, man, God's hands all over our life. But for me, the story continues because now what I'm seeing on the outside is that we don't fit in. I'm of a different pigmentation. My skin color somehow doesn't allow people to treat me as an equal. Even in church, I start to see this story, and I'm thinking, oh, I can't be part of this unless I'm like them. And so for me, the idea of having this name Joe was literally a teacher was like, what's your name? And I'm like, Eyob. And he's like, okay, what is it in English? It's Job. And so the teacher dropped the B and started calling me Joe. And I was like, cool. I belong. Every one of us has that. We all want to belong. It's a need. It's a human need. When you walked in this morning, I'm sure you wanted to feel like you belonged here. You were greeted. Someone called you by name, asked you a bunch of questions. I know I had some really good conversations. My identity was validated because I was acknowledged. And I'm sure this is why so many of us come here. I know this is why I come here. because I'm seen for who I am, not from the camouflage, the counterfeit Joe, but because I have no choice but to be honest here, because I'm in a congregation of a bunch of people who are really, really honest, because if they're not honest, then they're going to go back to addiction. You have no choice. And for me, I did not know this. I spent most of my life after that trying to take a shortcut. I thought I somehow figured out life. And on the outside, I even in my business, I have a name, and it's called Thrive. Like, I was like, Thrive, yeah. No, it should have been called Survive. I'll teach you how to survive. That's what I was really good at. And so that narrative continued throughout high school, through college, and at 17, I end up in Bible school. And here I am, passionate for God. And I have this encounter with God. And then from there, I end up 2 years later deciding I'm not a Christian anymore. Why? Because the school of Dean, who I looked up to, fell. He had a moral failing. And I thought, if it's not real for him, then this thing cannot be real. This is the guy that I was looking. What I didn't know the whole time was I was actually serving men. I wasn't serving God. All I was looking for was an affirmation from people. I didn't know God. So I studied God. I had knowledge of God in sense of from books. I studied the Gospels. I studied all of it. That's all I did for 2 years. And yet, I always say to people, I had knowledge about God, but I really didn't have a relationship with God. And I thought that God was going to be sufficient, but that was just a God that I had, again, created in my own, image to serve my needs. And so from there, I fall into, once you don't have God, I become kind of like, for the first time in my life, I'm like, wow, I'm free, really free now. I don't have this God thing, so I can practice hedonism 101. So I spent the next 7 years of my life going into this, it's the prodigal son when he finds himself hanging out with the pigs, and he's thinking, man, probably do better than this. That's what happened to me. I spent almost 5 years just in pursuit of, again, this need, this belonging, this love. And so I started pursuing it in drugs, and I just started to experiment and hang out with the wrong people. And long before you know what I was doing. And remember, I was an athlete. I had never used drugs my entire life. But as soon as I didn't have a reason, didn't have purpose, I thought, okay, well then, if there's no purpose, then any other purpose will do. And the first time I took a hit of ecstasy, I remember I thought I found God in a pill. I still remember the day as if it was yesterday. I was in Toronto hanging out at a frat house. I'm not even going to school. This is what you're doing, you're partying. And there's a guy, and all he did was, smoke up. That was his part. I think that was his degree in pharmaceuticals or something like that. But and so he offered it to me, and I was just like, I took a hit of it, and we were sitting outside. It was kind of spring. All of a sudden, I just felt this love. And I thought, oh, this is what I've been seeking my whole life. And that day, I don't know how I ended up, but it's so weird because you're high. I find myself somewhere downtown Toronto at an arcade. And I've been there for 8 hours straight. But that was the little hit that I got. That was like, oh, that was God. And so I started chasing that high, and that just took me to the worst of the worst places. And fast forward, I'm overdosed in a hospital, and in that place, I'm desperate because I find myself doing everything I never thought I would do. And my greatest fear was that I would disappoint my parents. And I remember at this hospital, Sunnybrook Hospital, a buddy of mine, quote unquote, just left me there because he didn't want nothing to do with me. And once I came to, the doctor comes into my room and he says to me, "You have to call your parents." I'm like, "I can't." He's like, "No, you have to call your parents." I said, "No, I can't." And he's like, "You have to." I said, I can't. You don't understand what my parents went through to get me to this place. And now I'm this guy. And I just couldn't confront the reality of my circumstances. But here's the beauty of God's grace. That doctor forced me to make the call. And I make the call. My father never answers the phone, ever. Hates the phone. Hello? And I just crack up and I start to tear up. And I just say, "Dad, it's me. I'm in a hospital." And my fear was that my dad would say, "Done with you." But my dad says, "Come home. We love you." And that just broke me. Because I experienced the true love of the Father. The narrative that I'd heard was that my dad never loved me, and that's why he left. But the truth was that my dad loved me, and that's why he left. And I thought, like, wow. And I have this crazy encounter. It's literally an encounter. Like, the addiction process is strange to me because I was so addicted, and I didn't know what to do. And then I have this encounter with this lady in a hospital. I still don't know if it's real or not, but I just remember the woman telling me, she's a white old lady, and she looks at me in the eyes and she says, "It's going to be okay." And I come back home and I go on this, I'm 30 years old almost, and I have to come back home. And here I am at home. And God, it's funny because John talks about his healing journey. For me, it was really weird. I didn't know about AA. I didn't know anything about that. But God magically put me in a situation where every morning there was this short Indian retired psychiatrist who would call me, "Joe, get up." 6 a.m. in the morning. And we'd do a Bible study every morning. And then every day I would go to church. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I don't think I went on Saturdays, Sundays. And all I did was serve. And I would sit. And God began to instruct me. God began to show me my true identity and who I was. And and God does something extraordinary because he takes my messes and turns it into my message. And all of a sudden, before you know it, you fast forward in 2004, I have a bunch of relapses along the way. By the way, it's not some easy story of like, a bunch of love. But every time I experience God's love, every time. And then suddenly, I'm a pastor. And I'm pastoring this church, and this church starts to grow, and I'm like, whew. And this is the version of Joe that shows up that I didn't know, the chaos creator. And I start to, like, I always say to people, like, if you're really messed up, pastoring is like the worst thing you can do. Because you're in like all kind of codependent relationships. You're making promises that you can't fulfill. You're running on adrenaline every morning because Sunday there's big events. And I was part of a church that was really charismatic. So it was feeding this need, for like just being seen and becoming really performative. And it was a culture that just influenced it because it was a bunch of people experiencing trauma that didn't know they were experiencing trauma, and we're just there doing what we think we can do. But in the end, what I learned through that process and through that story was that ministry to God got in the way of my relationship with God. Because my narrative is always to become a slave to men. And so all I was doing was, when I was at church, I was overwhelmed with anxiety every day because I was thinking, are they happy with me? Am I doing good enough? I'm trying to be the best version of myself so somebody can say, you're good, rather than go to God. And so in 2015, I have a massive burnout. And this is when I met John. And at the time, John was one of the few pastors to actually reach out to me. Actually, he was probably the only one. And he called and he said, you want to meet? And I'm like, oh, not really. I knew what kind of work he did. The last thing I wanted to do is meet a guy who's going to look right through me. I wanted to wallow in my misery, but he didn't stop. And I think in the book, it's one of the biggest lessons I've learned in the big book is the fact that we often want people to come to us. But when we're really, truly healed, we go out and we reach out and we find people. And so John didn't just hear the story and go, oh, well, too bad, so sad. He picked up the phone and called me. And it wasn't just one time. He called me the second time. And the second time, he offered, burgers. he upgraded from coffee, and I was just like, I'm coming. And we met, and the first thing he said to me is, are you shooting up needles? I'm like, well, it's kind of, but that was a good question. And I said no, but I was messed up. And through that process, and God began to do this incredible work and reestablish me again in ministry. But here you go. I now am in ministry. I'm hanging out at Union City. I've got a business. Things are going great. Not so fast, Joe. A couple of years ago, my business is growing, but I'm doing the very things I've always been doing, taking shortcuts. And I'm making promises that I can't fulfill. And I find myself in a mess financially. Instead of asking for help, I hide because of the shame. I'm not good enough. I suck. So what do? I take my family and I come up with this brilliant idea. We're going to Nicaragua. Sell everything. And I go to Nicaragua because I think I can outrun my pain. And sadly enough, my misery, my messes, all of it came with me. And I created even a bigger mess in Nicaragua. And this is where the story takes a really cool story arc, because that's where finally God confronted me, because he put me in a situation in which it was public. I was a pastor of many relationships. Everybody knew me. I could no longer just hide in my sin. Can no longer just keep it a secret. God made it public. And I say to people right now, I'm going through a therapy of exposure. God is exposing all my crap so that he can heal it. And it is difficult, but it's so beautiful. And the beautiful thing, what God is doing right now is that I believe God is a God of restoration. And God wants to restore us in a way that, and this is, amends. I was like, amends, what the heck? What does amends mean? And I'm learning that amends is like, when you make an amend with somebody, it's not asking for forgiveness. It's repairing the relationship in a manner that relationship becomes incredibly brand new, as if whatever you did never happened. And I thought, isn't that what the Gospels is? The story of the Gospel is that God takes my sins and restores me in a manner that, as if I'd never sinned. That's how he looks at me. And so God is changing my paradigm, is that my relationship with God now is not based on who I think I am, but who I think he is, who I know he is, And what I know him to be is he's a God of restoration. He's a God who truly, truly can fulfill all my needs. And the line that I have now, and it's what I say every day, is I want to please God and I want to serve man. And my job right now is to simply be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46. God is teaching me more in my sitting right now, and he's doing more in my sitting than all the activities of my life beforehand. I'm watching God just do miracle after miracle in my marriage, miracle in my relationship with my parents and my dad. I get to hang out with my dad every day because I live with him now. And I just want you to understand the story. I do believe the story arc of God is this, is that in order to heal us, God brings us to the very place that we started. And so I don't know where you guys might be right now. If you feel like you're being demoted and you feel like you're going down and you're thinking like, I'm in Jericho, I'm in my parents' home, or I have to like restart my whole life all over again. That is God's pattern of healing. Because God wants to bring you to that very place that he calls home so that you can be confronted with the reality of who you are. And when he confronts you with the reality and the truth of who you are, and I want to finish this with this because I know I'm way longer. Sorry, Pastor John. I just felt this is the story of Jacob. It says that night Jacob got up and took 2 wives, his 2 female servants and 11 sons, and crossed something I can't read anymore, the ford of Jacob. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and the men wrestled with him all daybreak. When the men saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let go until you bless me." The men asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then he said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans have overcome." What you don't know the story of Jacob is that his name means deceiver, liar. God brought him to a place in Bethel, home, to confront him with his true identity. And when he finally said, "Liar," God blessed him. And I learned this. This is the biggest lesson. God cannot bless a lie. God can't bless Joe, but God can bless Eyob. Because Eyob wrestled with God and has overcome with man. Thank you.